Now, many have started to lay off workers, with the SABC the latest to issue notices to staff. The state-owned broadcaster said it had notified 600 employees that they could be retrenched. Let's now discuss the state of affairs with Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird. William, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. The media landscape has changed over the past few weeks, a few media houses having taken a knock and others issuing notices. What does this mean for the media industry in its entirety during this time?
Hi, good morning. Well, our media industry, like so many of our other industries, are in a deep and profound economic crisis. You know, this COVID thing has taken an industry that was already experiencing a huge amount of stress to the next level. So if you look over the last couple of years, we've seen a significant number of job cuts across almost all of the big media houses. So just prior to the COVID crisis, we had a number of media people losing their jobs at all of the big media houses. We see that entities like the Mail and Guardian as a media house have been really struggling with how they are managing to survive and being sustainable. And then the COVID thing really takes fragile entities and pushes them over the edge. Some of our small commercial entities, I believe that 80 of them, 80, have already gone under, which is an absolute tragedy because, of course, there you're dealing with small commercial outfits that are based in communities that have no other way of surviving. So the SABC, in fact, is, if you like, a little bit late to the party in respect of having to cut the number of people that are there. So in as much as it's an awful thing and that no one wants to see, I can't see them being able to avoid this, frankly.
Now, as the easing in of the lockdown levels kicks in, we heard President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking about how the country will essentially need a new economy after this. Where does this leave the media sector, and perhaps what are the innovative ways to ensure that the industry does survive the pandemic?
Well, look, some of them are about finding new and better ways of doing things and finding new and better ways of how we operate. But the reality is, for something like the public broadcaster, they've got a public service mandate. So if you look at what's happening now in this current crisis, and this is going to continue from here, they've had to set up an entire educational channel. They've had to run, countless amounts of content, public service announcements. I'm not sure how many of those have been paid for, but that, all of that stuff costs it takes real resources. It costs things in terms of people's time, etc. So there are real costs that the SABC is expected, and appropriately so, to cover in order to meet the various needs of our nation. So the real question then becomes, for the public broadcaster, how do they fund themselves in a new environment? Also considering that the SABC, it is due a significant kind of upgrade. We know that over the last 5 to 10 years, they've been trying to get more resources to cover some of their capital costs. We've seen that, I think it was 2 years ago, the board reported on the dire state of their basic infrastructure. So there's a huge amount of capital investment that has to go into the public broadcaster to make it sustainable. For other media, I suspect that what we're going to see more people working from home, a lot more freelancers. We're going to see journalists having to make sure that they're innovative and do different things with how they try and raise some kind of income. Of course, the problem that entertains is that the moment a journalist, for example, says, well, I'll work for X and Y and Z news organizations, but at the same time I'm going to be a PR agent, that introduces all sorts of other problems. So it really is a very, very difficult time for media. But of course, the key element here to think about is that media is like every other industry in many respects, but it's also very different in that media fulfills a public good, which is why during the worst of the COVID crisis, media was declared an essential service because of the fundamental role that media does for our democracy.
Now, a report by SANEF has warned that this dark period for the media industry may not abate for some time. In fact, they've gone as far as creating a worst-case scenario for the South African economy in general, which now predicts a contraction of 16%, which would be the most severe recession in history. Now, out of this really dark time, what are some of the opportunities that may come out of it, especially as we look at the new normal?
So I think one of the things that we have to realize and appreciate, and that we have to then translate that into sustained resources, is the fundamental importance of news organizations and media particularly. You know, they're not just there, as I see you showing now, just the magazines and things for entertainment. If we look at the role that Newzroom Afrika performs, it's an especially critical role for a democratic country as ours, to bring a different perspective, to make sure that people can be informed. And the reality is that that's closer to a public good than it is something to a money-making venture. And so as we move forward, we've got to say, well, how do we start to resource things that are actually public goods as opposed to things that are just there to try and make money? We know that this is not a new crisis. You know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, some of the biggest brand names in news organizations have, they really struggled. Had it not been for the New York Times being bought out by millionaires and the Guardian's massive trust that they have, and the Washington Post also being bought out by a billionaire, they would have gone under. You know, so it's not like this is unusual to South Africa, but it does mean, of course, with our fewer resources as a nation generally, we do need to find alternatives. So I think that we are going to see new and emerging models. If you look at a model like the Daily Maverick, things that rely on closer ideas of subscription. I think the one that's being trialled currently by Newzroom Afrika itself is a very good example of something that may set up a new standard in terms of, you know, where they're getting their resources from. And effectively, it appears to me that there's a lot of cross-subsidization coming from multi-choice to ensure that they're able to offer this as a news offering and make sure that it's sustainable and that it can continue. And that itself is an important model. And then, of course, we're going to have to look again as we open up, going back to media, using other revenue streams, events, and those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and analysis there. Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird.